Hi everyone, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for a PB&J card class, and this is another video in a series of several featuring Penny Black's newest Scenic stamps. And today I will be stamping with this really unique stamp called Desert Dreams, and I will be showing two different techniques with this stamp. So the first card here that you're looking at features some watercolor techniques with this stamp, and the next features some basic stamping and ink blending to create this card. Now, before I begin, I just wanted to mention that I will have a complete supply list up on screen at the very end of the video. This will feature all the supplies used, the stamps, the inks, the colors, everything for both of these cards. Now to begin, we're going to create the card that features the ink blending techniques, and I am stamping in my Misty Stamp Positioning tool onto smooth white cardstock. And to start off with this stamp, because there's lots of little details, especially in that ground area, I went ahead and just stamped that with some Memento Toffee Crunch ink just to get a basic light color down for the entire image. Then I'll go in now and work on some of these details. Now to color in on these small areas and do some selective coloring, I am using my Arteza Real Brush pens. The tip on these pens is really nice. It really feels like you're using a paintbrush and you can really get in on the details. And I'm starting with just all of these large cacti and coloring those in and just stamping them down. Now you could do this with any of your water-based markers, so like your distress markers, Tombow dual brush pens, your zig markers, all of those work great for this. I colored onto the cactus itself, and then just to add some really dark shading here, I'm just coloring directly with that marker right onto my paper, following the lines that are provided within the stamp. Next, I'm going to grab a different green and I'm going to color some of these other plants here. And it's really nice by having that layer of toffee crunch, that light brown layer that we stamped at the beginning. It just kind of automatically darkens up all these different shades of greens and yellows and browns that we'll be putting on, and makes it a little bit easier to also capture the details. So when you're coloring with a marker onto your stamp, you're going to see some of those brush strokes from the marker, and an ink pad actually gives you the best coverage because it's a flat surface onto another flat surface. So if you stamp it first with a really pretty light color like this and then add your other colors on top, if your marker coverage isn't perfect, it'll still look that way because you've already had that sort of even layer of that light initial stamping color. I'm using this lighter color to just add different colors to the ground. So in the desert, everything is really brown, but I didn't want this card to look too flat. So I just selectively picked a few spots here and there on the card to put some lighter green onto the ground. Here I'm doing a little bit of a yellow or a gold color. I started with some of the more predominant parts of the stamp, like those large cactuses or cacti, and then working more into these just little details and different rocks and different things onto the ground. To me, I was really excited to see that we had this new desert stamp by Penny Black. I used to live in the desert and I just find it to be magical. And and also sort of a transformative place. So I think that this stamp is really great for encouragement cards, and you could even use it for masculine cards, summer birthday cards. But I just found it really fun to work with, and it's kind of deceiving. Sometimes you see stamps like this that have lots of really small details and think they may be difficult to work with. They're actually, for me, easier to work with than stamps that have large expanses of solid areas or large areas that need to be colored in. All these little details, just by adding different browns, a few different greens here and there, it will look finished. And it doesn't take very long because you're just adding sort of splashes of color throughout the image here and there. Now towards the center of this sort of walkway or path, I did add some of this yellow in there just to kind of lighten things up. I didn't find that there was much or any cross-contamination of color onto my markers. So you can see I'm putting lots of different colors onto the stamp. Most of that, once you stamp it down, transfers onto the paper, so I didn't have any problems with needing to clean the stamp in between each color. But if you're worried about that, or you find that's happening with the particular markers you're doing, you can definitely just clean that stamp as you go. Just be sure that your paper and your stamp do not move within your stamp positioning tool. I really liked how this yellow, when I added it in, this golden color, brightened everything up and just gave this even more life and just a great feeling overall to the stamping. Now I'm going to clean my stamp off. I sprayed it with just some water, and I'm cleaning it with a microfiber towel that gets it nice and clean, nice and dry, and also doesn't leave any fuzz like sometimes you get from baby wipes. I'm going to pat my paper with an anti-static bag, and now I'm going to ink up that stamp with some Versamark ink. And this is just a clear sticky ink that will stamp over everything else that we've already stamped. And I'm going to sprinkle that then with some clear embossing powder. And this is going to seal in all of this stamping, and we can apply our inks on top and it will resist any of that ink. So all the brightness of color that we've achieved in our stamping will remain even when we add other ink colors on top. So I'm just removing that from my stamp positioning tool, and I'm going to add that embossing. And you can see there's something just really amazing about the stamp. It almost looks like a photograph. It's really cool, really fun to work with. So I heat that to go and set that embossing ink. Now I'm going in with a Ranger Detail Ink Blending Tool, some of that Toffee Crunch ink, and I just want to add some variation down here on the ground. And this small tool gives me lots of control of where I am adding that color. So I'm just working that in. I'm leaving for now that pathway pretty much white. And here I'm just going to grab, I found over on this side, I could just add a lot of that in without having to do that detail blending tool, so I'm using a sponge dauber. Now for the inks that you apply onto your background, you will want to choose dye inks. So I am using some Wendy Vecchi Make Art blendable dye inks, and I'm also using this Memento ink Toffee Crunch. You could use your distress inks. Any dye ink will work for this portion of the technique. And you can see all of that stamping that we've done, those oranges and greens and variations of browns are remaining those crisp, bright colors even as we add these darker inks on top. Now here I'm just adding a little bit more shadow down here at the bottom of this pathway, giving the illusion here and the depth and perspective that it's sort of moving out into the distance. And now I'm using a fingertip sponge dauber. Again, this just gives me a little bit more control. I can add the ink in a smaller area, and using some orange blossom ink. And the same concept applies as where we added just different colors of browns and oranges and yellows when we stamped. I'm going to do the same thing here with that background inking, so that even though that's the desert and mostly all brown, it doesn't get too boring as you're looking at this. So just touches of orange, some touches of this sunflower yellow color around just kind of randomly throughout the image. Now I'm ready to work on the sky, so I'm just using a piece of scratch computer thin typing paper, and I'm holding it down with my hand. If you're worried about that sort of wiggling around on you while you are doing your inking, you could use the sticky edge of some post-it notes there, some post-it note tape, or even some like Eclipse masking paper. Here I'm starting on the edge of that scratch paper using an ink blending tool with a foam pad and sort of flicking that up towards the top of the sky. And that completes the inking for that card. Now for this, I've stamped a sentiment from the left-hand side here from the set called Heartfelt. These are just a few of our older sentiments I thought really worked well with these Scenic stamps. So I put them all up here, but I did use one from the left and added it there to the card. I added a very basic white frame, and that completed this card with the ink blending. Now we'll move on to the watercolor technique. So for this, I again stamped this with the Toffee Crunch ink just like I did before, And now I am going in with the Faber-Castell Stampers Big Brush pens. So I wanted to use mediums on the stamp now that are waterproof or archival. That way when we add our watercoloring directly on top, none of these will blend or bleed as we paint the background and paint the ground. Now for some areas, and I apologize for my head there, I did go ahead and just color directly onto the paper just to add some extra shading and depth of color. You can see me doing that a little bit better now. So the stamping technique for this is a lot the same as the first card. We're just using the Stampers Big Brush pens so that we have that archival color achieved. And I am stamping onto Canson 140-pound watercolor paper. Now this paper does have some texture to it, so it's a little bit more difficult to capture some of the details of the stamp. So you can see here, sometimes I just went ahead and colored right on top with those markers. So I had that toffee crunch brown already there. I can see right where I need to color, and I can just color right on top of the paper if I need to, if some of that texture of the paper is making it difficult to stamp the smaller details. I'm adding in the oranges and the different color variations to the ground. When you're working on this, you may want to have your packaging of your stamp nearby if you're looking for some ideas on where to add the coloring or some color choices. Sometimes it's nice just to have that right nearby as you're working. Adding those yellows on top. And again, you can see the benefit of having that light layer of toffee crunch already stamped onto the paper because you're just kind of lightly colorizing it with these markers. You don't need to get the perfect impression with the marker. It was interesting for this stamp, the difference between the two techniques. I felt like the ink blending technique, the first card we did, really had a photographic look to it. It looked like a picture almost. And for this card, I found it had a really neat sort of vintage look to it with the watercoloring. And I love to just play around with colors, so you definitely wouldn't need to spend quite as much time as I'm doing here with that painting or the background, but I just found it was fun to add those different colors in there. Now for this card, I'm going to start with my sky, and I'm just using Sakura Koi Field Sketch Box watercolors to paint this in. You can use whatever watercolors that you love and you have on hand. I'm not doing any crazy or wild or difficult shading techniques, starting with the blue down near the horizon line and then blending it out towards the top with water. I don't want this to have a real perfect smooth look. I want it to look like it's watercolored. And then for the ground, I'm just going to add sort of tone on tone looks. So where I've stamped mostly yellow, I'll grab some yellow watercolors. Where it's the oranges and the reds, I'll grab that color and paint it on top. And I think that color on there, it still looks like the desert, but it keeps it from looking too flat or too boring. And here I'll come in with just some browns to sort of blend and even all of that out together and give it a nice cohesive look. Now I did speed this up just because I'm making two cards and it gets kind of long if I don't speed this up. But it is fun to, with these scenic cards, to just relax and take your time painting. You could stamp a bunch of these in your stamp positioning tool and then try different painting techniques, different variations in colors. I think this would also look really neat if you painted it like a sunset. So did more darker browns and blacks for the ground and the cacti, and then did more of a sunset in the sky and a darker ground when you added your painting. While all of that is still a little bit wet, I can go in and drop and add more color in to that background. I'm going to go ahead and dry that with my heat tool before I move on. These do dry quite a bit lighter, so sometimes it's nice to get an idea of how they're going to dry before adding more detail. And I wanted to, as I finish this up, darken these up a little bit. So I did dry that, and then I can go in and paint right on top of that stamping just to give them a little bit more life. You can do the same thing here, add some additional shading. A little bit of that got into the sky, so I'm just blending that out. And I guess since I got a little green in there, we'll just go for it all over and fix that. And I actually like how that turned out. It added to that sort of vintage look with more of a turquoise color up in the sky. To finish this off, I die cut my Scenic panel with the stitched nested frames shown on the left. I'm also showing you our leaf stitched frames, which I think would also work great with this stamp. And for this, the sentiment came from our new destination sentiments. That is the sentiment here in the center. And these are really great with this desert stamp and all of our new Scenic stamps. And here's a look at that finished card. It is a standard A2 size card, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I hope you enjoyed today's video and are inspired to give this desert stamp a try. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as our website and blog. And I will link to all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. Here is the supply list for that first card, and the second will be up in just a minute. Thanks for watching.